All right, here we go. Geometry, a little review, a little refresher on trigonometry, a word that sounds hard, but it's actually, the process isn't that bad once you get the whole idea of what sine, cosine, and tangent are. So let's start off with that. Anytime you hear trigonometry, you're going to do a trigonometry problem, you should be putting on the paper SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA. A lot of people want to say SOHCAHTOA, but that gets you mixed up with the O and the A here. So SOHCAHTOA. It's an acronym to use to help us create the sine function. So this S right here stands for sine. And we usually say of an angle measure, we'll say theta, just a variable, a Greek letter theta representing an unknown variable for a angle measure. And the sine is going to equal, this is opposite over top of hypotenuse. So again, S is the sine, then O is on top and H is on bottom. SOH is sine, is opposite over hypotenuse. Sine of the angle really is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. The next letter here you see is C, and that stands for cosine. Again, of an angle measure equals, now this is adjacent. A is on top, adjacent over top of hypotenuse. And the last letter there, the T function is tangent. The tangent of an angle measure is equal to opposite over adjacent. And we'll talk about what those words mean right now. So again, SOHCAHTOA. So is S-O-H, Ska is C-A-H, and TOA is T-O-A. So it helps us create these three equations: the sine function ratio of sides, the cosine function's ratio of two sides adjacent hypotenuse, and the tangent function's ratio of two sides opposite over adjacent. What we're really talking about, if you remember, is you'll have a right triangle and you'll have some angle measure theta. Maybe it's 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 50 degrees, something. For this right here, this degree measure for that angle, you're going to have this side across from the right angle is going to be the hypotenuse. If you'll remember from Pythagorean theorem section, the hypotenuse is always the longest side. It's always the biggest side. It's always the side longest across from the biggest angle, the 90-degree angle. These are both acute angles. They're less than 90 degrees. So across from the biggest angle, you have the biggest side called the hypotenuse. Most important part of trigonometry, identify hypotenuse. The next is you're dealing with an angle measure. So opposite or across from that side, so kind of if I draw an arrow this way, opposite that is going to be called the opposite side. And then right next to that angle measure is called the adjacent side. So it's all based on where the right angle is. That's the hypotenuse. That's the easiest one. And then the other two sides are based on where is the angle measure that they're giving you. And we're here calling it theta. It might be a 20 degree, it might be a 50 degree, but that's the angle that they're giving you in the trig problem. So you're basing your opposite and adjacent based on what angle. If the angle's down here, then this is opposite side. Draw an arrow if you want to. It's across, it's opposite. And then right next to it's here. If that angle measure was given up here, if this was 50 or 30 or 50, 62 degrees, then that side would be opposite and that would be adjacent. So we might see some of those as we're doing a problem or two together. Let me see what I got here. That's the lesson, and you should be able to do something like this on your worksheet once you have that idea in place. Number one looks like this, where you have a right triangle. There's your right angle. You have a 72 degrees down here, and you have an X right there. They also tell you this side length down here is 6. So with this problem, this is a trig problem because it's got a right angle. So it's a right triangle. It's not a Pythagorean theorem problem because there's only one side given, not two. If they gave you a 6 and an 8 over here, you could use Pythagorean theorem and solve for the other side. But since they're giving us an angle measure this time, that's the next little step up in right triangles. Now we're dealing with an angle measure. They have an angle measure and a side given. We can use that information together using trigonometry to solve for the missing side length here, x. And that's the goal. They're giving us a side and an angle measure. Whereas in Pythagorean theorem, you got two sides and you try to solve for the third. Anytime you see an angle measure in a right triangle, you're probably dealing with some sort of trigonometry. Here we go. First thing you want to do, like I said, is identify the hypotenuse, and that comes from being across from the right angle there. So I'll put HYP right there. Here's the angle measure they're giving us, so I can put opposite. I'll put OPP over there, and then right next to that 72, the 6 is the adjacent side. What that does for us after we label, every time I do these types of problems, I have SOHCAHTOA written on my paper, and I identify right away what side is the hypotenuse, the opposite, and then the adjacent. And by doing that, I see that I'm going to be using the x value there, and I'm going to be using the 6. There's no information for hypotenuse, or sorry, opposite in that case, so I'm getting rid of that, and I'm using the hypotenuse and adjacent. That's the A and the H. A and the H. Not O and H. There's the A and the H, not O and H. So I'm going to be using cosine. Since I have the adjacent and hypotenuse, I'm not going to use sine. I'm not going to use tangent. The A and the H are together with the cosine, or the ka part of SOHCAHTOA. So cosine, that's the first time I'm using SOHCAHTOA. It's going to be cosine of the angle equals adjacent over hypotenuse. Right there. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Let's put that together. The cosine of what? The angle, which is 72. Cosine of 72 degrees should equal adjacent, which is 6, over the x. 6 over x. Now, we have to remember back to Algebra 1, when you have a variable on the bottom and if you have a fraction like this, we can switch the x out here, and really we're going to be dividing by the cosine of 72. There's some basic properties of Algebra 1 that you can use to get that taken care of. You can look at that in a different video. Putting this in your calculator, you end up with, I think I put it in there, you got a 19.4. So the length of the hypotenuse in this case is 19.4. Had to use cosine because that's the information they gave us in the problem. Let's look at another one real quick. Let's say number 12. And number 12 looks like this, where we have this triangle kind of turned over, rotated, flipped, whatever you want to say. It's 22 out here and 21 degrees in there, and they want to find out what this x value is. So right away, again, hypotenuse, opposite, adjacent. So I look at the right angle, I say, okay, there's the hypotenuse. Here's the angle measure, so across from that's got to be opposite, and next to it's got to be adjacent. This time I don't have the adjacent, there's nothing there. Here I have an x, here I have a 22, so I'm not using adjacent in this problem, I'm using opposite and hypotenuse. That's the O and the H. So I jump back up to SOHCAHTOA, the O and the H goes with the sine function, so I'm using this for number 12. The sine of the angle measure here, 21 degrees, should equal, it says, opposite over hypotenuse. Opposite's the x, hypotenuse is 22. X over 22. When we have this algebra problem where the x is on top, not on bottom, well, in this case we divided. Over here we're going to be multiplying. Multiply by 22 over here to get rid of that. Multiply by 22. So really 22 times the sine of 21 in your calculator should equal that x value. I got that 7.9 when I did my work. You can check that and see if it works out with you. If you have an iPhone, you can turn the iPhone sideways when you're in the calculator, and it'll expand, and you can start doing trig functions and square roots and squares and all that. So take a look at that. Notice the difference between having the x in the bottom, we're taking the number and dividing by the trig function, or having the x in the top, we're taking the number and multiplying by the trig function, 22 times 20, sine of 21. Should be a good review. Remember SOHCAHTOA. If you can remember SOHCAHTOA, you can set up these equations. You can figure out which function you need to use out of sine or cosine depending on what information they give you. Set up the equation, solve for x, and you're done. It's really not that hard. once you understand how to create these equations with the information given. See you guys on Thursday. We'll talk then more about this. Try to complete your worksheet and show me. Thanks. Have a good day.